No one warns you about this moment. The moment you look at the woman you married and realize she is not the same anymore. She's quieter. She questions things she once accepted. She no longer argues the way she used to. And somehow that silence feels heavier than shouting ever did. Many men call this midlife crisis. Some call it coldness. Some call it loss of love. But the truth is far more unsettling. This is not where she breaks. This is where she wakes up. And most marriages don't survive. Not because love disappeared, but because one partner never noticed the transformation happening right in front of them. Let me tell you why women change after 40 and what that change is really about. For many women, the early half of life is not truly lived, it is performed. From a young age, she learns that love is conditional, that safety comes from being agreeable, that belonging is earned through self-adjustment. She becomes fluent in anticipation. She reads moods before they are spoken. She softens her edges so others can remain comfortable. This is not deception, it is adaptation. And for years, it works. It brings approval, stability, and a sense of being needed, but it also builds an invisible structure around her inner life, one that slowly tightens as time passes. Marriage often deepens this pattern. She enters it with hope, but also with an unspoken contract: I will hold things together. She becomes the emotional memory of the household, the silent mediator, the one who absorbs tension so peace can exist on the surface. When conflict arises, she bends first. When exhaustion appears, she pushes through it. When disappointment surfaces, she rationalizes it away. She tells herself that this is maturity, that sacrifice is love, that her feelings can wait. And so they do, year after year, waiting quietly in the background. But the psyche keeps its own ledger. Around the threshold of 40, something ancient begins to stir. It is not rebellion. It is not bitterness. It is an inner reckoning. The woman senses, often without words, that the identity she has been living from is no longer sustainable. The pleasing self, the one built for approval and survival, starts to feel like a skin that no longer fits. What once felt like strength now feels like self-erasure, and the exhaustion she experiences is not physical, it is existential. She is tired of being agreeable at the cost of being real. This moment is deeply psychological. In the first half of life, the ego is concerned with adaptation, fitting in, building roles, securing love. But the second half demands something different. It demands truth. The inner voice that was once suppressed now insists on being heard. It asks questions she can no longer ignore. Who am I when I am not pleasing? What remains when I stop performing goodness for others? What part of me has gone unlived? The death of the pleasing self is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with confrontation. More often, it begins as a quiet withdrawal. She stops over-explaining. She stops volunteering for emotional labor that goes unseen. She stops cushioning her words to protect others from discomfort. This is often misinterpreted as coldness, but it is actually a return of energy to its rightful owner. The energy that once flowed outward in service now turns inward in search of meaning. This shift can be frightening to her partner and even to herself, because the pleasing self was rewarded, it was praised, it was familiar. Letting it die feels like risking rejection. Yet something deeper understands that the greater danger is continuing to live in fragments. Psychologically, what is happening is a confrontation with the shadow, all the unmet needs, unexpressed anger, and unlived desires that were pushed aside to maintain harmony. These elements do not disappear with time, they accumulate, and when they finally surface, they do so with intensity and clarity. Real life offers countless examples of this transformation. A woman who spent decades saying yes suddenly begins to say no without apology. Another who organized everyone's emotional world realizes no one ever asked how she was doing. One day, she notices that her kindness has become expected, her silence interpreted as consent, her presence taken for granted, and in that realization, something breaks, not her heart, but the illusion that self-abandonment is love. The death of the pleasing self is not the loss of femininity or warmth. It is the loss of false accommodation. She does not become harsher, she becomes truer. Her compassion remains, but it is no longer self-sacrificing. Her love remains, but it now requires reciprocity. She begins to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are the architecture of self-respect, and without them, intimacy cannot survive. This inner death often creates tension in marriage because the relationship was unconsciously structured around her compliance. When that compliance fades, the system destabilizes. The partner may feel confused or threatened, asking, "Why are you different now?" But the more accurate question is, why was this version of you required for the relationship to function? The woman is not changing into someone new, she is shedding what was never fully her. Psychologically, this stage represents an initiation. The pleasing self must die so a more integrated self can emerge. One that includes assertiveness, desire, anger, and autonomy, alongside care and devotion. Without this death, the second half of life becomes a repetition of the first, but emptier. With it, there is the possibility of wholeness. This process is painful because death always is. The woman grieves the years she spent shrinking. She mourns the version of herself that believed love had to be earned through endurance. But grief is not regression, it is integration. Through it, she reclaims parts of herself that were exiled long ago. And in doing so, she steps into a deeper, more grounded form of love. One that no longer asks her to disappear in order to belong. The death of the pleasing self is not a rejection of others. It is an acceptance of self. And once that acceptance occurs, there is no returning to the old performance. Because the psyche, once awakened to truth, cannot unlearn it. There comes a moment in a woman's life when time stops behaving like a wide open horizon and begins to feel like a narrowing path. Not because her life is ending, but because she finally understands that it is hers. In her earlier years, time felt generous. There was always later to speak up, later to change, later to be loved more deeply, to be understood more fully. She could endure discomfort because she believed endurance itself would be rewarded. Time, she thought, would soften the sharp edges of dissatisfaction, but time does not soften what is ignored, it sharpens it. As she moves toward midlife, something fundamental shifts in her perception of time. It is no longer measured by calendars or birthdays, but by inner questions. She begins to sense that her life is not an endless draft but a finite manuscript. This awareness is not morbid, it is clarifying. The psyche awakens to the fact that half of the journey has already been lived, and the remaining half cannot be spent unconsciously. What once felt tolerable now feels costly. What once felt patient now feels postponed. This change is often triggered quietly, a passing glance at her reflection, a child growing independent, the loss of a parent, a body that no longer recovers as quickly. These moments are not dramatic, but they are symbolic. They whisper a truth that grows louder with time. You do not have unlimited chances to be yourself. And with that realization, the way she invests her energy begins to change. In marriage, this shift is deeply unsettling, especially if her partner still relates to time as abundance. She no longer wants to wait and see if emotional closeness will improve. She no longer believes that unspoken needs will magically be met someday. She understands now that every year spent in emotional starvation is not neutral. It is subtractive. It takes something from her that cannot be restored. Earlier in life, she may have accepted minimal connection in exchange for stability. She may have convinced herself that emotional loneliness was normal, that passion fades, that understanding is optional. But now, time exposes the lie beneath those beliefs. She sees that staying silent did not preserve peace, it preserved distance. She sees that waiting did not lead to growth, it led to repetition. And this awareness creates an urgency that can no longer be soothed by excuses. Psychologically, this is the moment when time becomes internalized. Instead of asking, "How long will this last?" she asks, "How much of myself am I losing by staying this way?" This is not impatience, it is discernment. She begins to recognize that her remaining years deserve intention, not endurance. And this recognition changes how she loves, how she commits, and how she tolerates. Many women describe this shift in simple, honest language. One says, "I realized I didn't want to spend my future recovering from my past." Another says, "I stopped asking if I could survive this marriage and started asking if I could grow in it." These are not dramatic declarations. They are quiet awakenings. But once they occur, they rearrange everything. This new relationship with time also changes how she views herself. She stops postponing her desires as if they are indulgent. She stops minimizing her need for depth, presence, and emotional truth. She no longer sees self-sacrifice as noble if it leads to self-erasure. Instead, she begins to feel a responsibility to our own becoming. Time now feels like a sacred resource. And sacred things are not wasted. For her partner, this can feel sudden and unfair. Why now, he may wonder. Why is this suddenly a problem? But the problem was never sudden, only the awareness was. She did not wake up one day dissatisfied. She woke up aware that dissatisfaction had been normalized for too long. Time didn't change her expectations. It exposed how low they had been set. There is also grief in this awakening. She mourns the years she spent believing she had to earn emotional closeness through patience. She grieves the version of herself who believed time would fix what honesty might have addressed earlier. But this grief is not paralyzing. It is motivating. It pushes her toward choices that align with her inner truth rather than her outer roles. In this stage of life, love becomes more intentional. She no longer wants gestures without presence, words without follow-through, or commitment without emotional engagement. Not because she has become demanding, but because she understands the cost of accepting less. She sees clearly now every unlived truth becomes a future regret, and regret is what she fears more than conflict, more than change, more than being misunderstood. Seeing time differently does not make her cold. It makes her awake. She still loves deeply, but she no longer loves blindly. She still gives, but she measures whether her giving leads to connection or depletion. She understands that time will pass regardless, and the only real question is whether she will pass through it consciously or disappear quietly within it. This is why her change feels so profound. Time has stopped being so me thing that happens to her. It has become something she participates in. And once a woman understands that her life is not waiting to begin but already unfolding, she can no longer afford to live as though her needs are optional or her truth is negotiable. At a certain point in a woman's life, asking begins to feel heavier than silence. Not because she no longer has needs, but because those needs have already been spoken, clearly, patiently, and more times than she can count. Earlier, she believed that love was a dialogue that, if she explained herself well enough, understanding would follow. She chose her words carefully. She softened her tone. She waited for the right moment. She gave the benefit of the doubt. And each time she spoke, she hoped that this would be the moment her inner world would finally be received. In the beginning, her requests were small and reasonable. She asked for attention that did not feel distracted, for conversations that went beyond logistics, for gestures that carried emotional weight instead of routine. When those requests were met with forgetfulness, defensiveness, or temporary effort followed by relapse, she did not withdraw. She adapted. She explained again, this time more gently, more clearly, more generously. She assumed misunderstanding where there was actually avoidance. She assumed busyness where there was emotional absence. She kept asking, not because she enjoyed it, but because she believed persistence was proof of love. What she did not realize at first was that repeated explanation without response does something subtle to the psyche. It creates a quiet erosion of self-worth. Each unmet request carries an unspoken message. What you need is not important enough to change for. Over time, she internalizes this message, not consciously but deeply. She begins to doubt the legitimacy of her feelings. She wonders if she is too sensitive, too demanding, too much, and so she tries harder to be less. This is where many misunderstand the moment she stops asking. They assume she has stopped caring. In reality, she has stopped hoping. Hope, when consistently unmet, becomes emotionally dangerous. It exposes her again and again to disappointment. Psychologically, the mind learns to protect itself by withdrawing expectation. This is not punishment, it is self-preservation. When she stops asking, it is because she has reached a painful clarity. Explaining herself will not create empathy where none is being practiced. She understands that being heard requires not just words but willingness on the other side. And once she sees that willingness is absent, repeating herself begins to feel like self-betrayal. Silence becomes less exhausting than pleading. This silence, however, is not empty. It is full of conclusions. She is no longer asking whether her partner understands her. She is observing whether he is willing to. She is no longer negotiating for emotional presence. She is measuring its absence. And this internal shift changes the emotional climate of the relationship entirely. The conversations may continue, but the vulnerability does not. The questions disappear, but so does the intimacy. There is often a moment, quiet and unnoticed, when she realizes she has already grieved the relationship while still inside it. This grief happens privately. There are no dramatic scenes, no ultimatums. She mourns the connection she hoped for, the version of partnership she believed was possible. She mourns the effort she invested without reciprocity. And through this mourning, something inside her detaches, not angrily, but conclusively. Research into long-term relationships shows that emotional withdrawal usually comes after prolonged emotional neglect, not before it. By the time she stops asking, she has already tried everything she knows how to try. She has lowered her expectations. She has adjusted her needs. She has given time, patience, and grace. What she is withdrawing from now is not the relationship itself, but the illusion that her needs will eventually be met if she just asks one more time. For her partner, this stage is often confusing. The conflict has stopped. The complaints have faded. On the surface, things seem calmer, but beneath that calm is a decisive shift. She's no longer fighting for connection. She's conserving energy. She has stopped inviting someone into her inner world who repeatedly chose not to enter it. And this is why the silence feels different. It is not charged with emotion, it is settled. Psychologically, this marks a transition from expression to integration. She begins to reclaim the parts of herself that were exposed without being received. She learns to hold her own feelings without seeking validation for them. This can look like emotional distance, but it is actually emotional maturity. She is no longer trying to be understood at the cost of her dignity. Many women describe this moment with heartbreaking simplicity. I didn't stop talking because I had nothing to say, one says. I stopped because I realized I had already said it all. Another admits, the day I went quiet was the day I accepted that my words were never the issue. These realizations do not arrive with anger, they arrive with clarity. This is also the moment when love changes its shape. It becomes less hopeful, less anticipatory. It no longer leans forward. She still cares, but she cares without expectation. And when love loses expectation, it loses its vulnerability. That vulnerability does not vanish. It retreats inward, where it can no longer be dismissed or ignored. When a woman stops asking for what she has already explained, it is not a strategy, it is an ending. Not necessarily the end of the relationship in form, but the end of emotional negotiation. She has learned, painfully and thoroughly, that being understood requires more than words. It requires presence, responsiveness, and choice. And once she accepts that those elements are not forthcoming, she stops offering her inner world to someone who has shown they will not hold it. Her silence is not a demand. It is a boundary drawn by exhaustion. And by the time it appears, it is usually too late to respond with words, because the moment for listening has already passed. There comes a stage in a woman's life when something long buried begins to rise, not as a rebellion, but as a remembering. It is the return of an identity that was never lost, only postponed. For many years, she lived divided. One part of her managed responsibilities, relationships, expectations. Another part waited quietly in the background, carrying unexpressed desires, untaken paths, and questions that had no place in her daily life. This division was not a failure. It was a strategy. It allowed her to survive, to belong, to fulfill roles that demanded consistency more than authenticity. But the psyche does not tolerate division indefinitely. What is pushed aside does not disappear, it gathers strength. Over time, the ignored self becomes heavier, more insistent. And eventually, usually in midlife, the effort required to keep it buried becomes greater than the effort required to face it. This is when her identity begins to return. Not as it was in youth, but refined, sharpened, and more demanding of truth. Earlier in life, her identity was shaped largely by adaptation. She learned who she was by learning what was expected of her. She became a good partner, a reliable presence, a stabilizing force. These qualities were real, but incomplete. They represented only the parts of her that fit easily into her environment. The rest, her ambition, her anger, her need for solitude, her creative impulses, were often postponed for later. Later, she believed, would be safer. Later would allow space. But later has arrived, and it no longer asks politely. The return of identity often begins with small disruptions. She may crave time alone without explanation. She may feel drawn toward interests that have nothing to do with her established roles. She may begin questioning routines that once felt unquestionable. These changes can seem random to others, but internally they are coherent. They are signals from the deeper self, asking to be included in the life that is being lived. This return is stronger than before because it is no longer naive. In youth, identity is exploratory and fragile, easily shaped by approval and rejection. In midlife, identity is tempered by experience. She knows what compromise costs. She knows what happens when she abandons herself too long. And because of this knowledge, the self that returns does not ask for permission. It arrives with boundaries. In marriage, this can feel destabilizing. The relationship may have been built around the version of her that was consistently available, accommodating, predictable. When her identity expands, it introduces unpredictability, not chaos, but depth. She may no longer define herself solely through the relationship. She may want to be met not just as a partner, but as an individual with an inner life that exists independently. This is often misread as withdrawal, when in fact it is differentiation. Psychologically, this phase represents integration. The qualities she once split off, assertiveness, desire, ambition, even anger, are now reclaimed. She does not become less loving. She becomes less self-denying. She does not reject connection. She rejects the version of connection that required her to remain partial. Her sense of self becomes more complex, more grounded, and therefore less negotiable. Many women describe this return with a sense of surprise. I didn't know I missed myself until I found myself again. Others say, I feel like I'm finally living from the inside out. These statements point to a profound shift. She is no longer organizing her life around external validation. She is organizing it around internal alignment. What feels right begins to matter more than what looks right. This change often brings fear, not only for those around her, but within herself. To reclaim identity is to risk disapproval. It is to step outside familiar roles and face the possibility of misunderstanding. But by this stage, the fear of staying divided outweighs the fear of being seen. She has learned that belonging without authenticity is a quiet form of isolation. And isolation, she knows now, can exist even in the presence of others. The strength of her returning identity lies in its rootedness. It is not impulsive. It is not reactionary. It has been forming quietly for decades. Every unspoken thought, every deferred desire, every moment of self-silencing contributed to its depth. When it emerges, it carries clarity. She becomes more selective with her energy, more intentional with her time. She no longer disperses herself to maintain harmony at the cost of truth. This does not mean she abandons care or tenderness. Those qualities remain, but they are no longer offered at the expense of self-respect. Her compassion includes herself now, and this inclusion changes the tone of everything she does. Her voice becomes steadier, her decisions become firmer. She is less reactive because she is less fragmented. The return of identity is not about reclaiming youth, it is about reclaiming authorship. She understands now that her life is not something she must earn the right to inhabit, it is something she must consciously choose. And once this choice is made, it becomes impossible to return to the smaller self she once inhabited. This is why her identity returns stronger than before. It is no longer dependent on approval or sustained by endurance. It is anchored in self-recognition, and from that place, she does not need to announce who she is becoming. She simply lives it. For much of her life, loneliness was the quiet fear that shaped her decisions, not the obvious kind, the empty house or the silent phone, but the deeper fear of being unchosen, unsupported, or unseen. This fear taught her to stay, to endure discomfort, to accept relationships that offered familiarity instead of fulfillment. Being alone felt like failure, while being unhappy felt like something she could manage. So she learned to manage it well. In her earlier years, the presence of another person, even an emotionally distant one, felt safer than the uncertainty of solitude. Togetherness, no matter how thin, was interpreted as stability. She told herself that companionship was enough, that wanting more was unrealistic, that unhappiness was simply the price of commitment. And for a long time, this belief held. It allowed her to remain in situations that required patience more than joy, endurance more than truth. But as she moves deeper into herself, something shifts in the way she measures pain. She begins to notice that loneliness can exist even when someone is beside her, that sharing a life with another does not guarantee being known. The ache of being emotionally invisible, she realizes, is far more corrosive than the ache of physical solitude. One isolates her from others, the other isolates her from herself. This realization does not arrive dramatically. It comes through accumulation, through years of conversations that never quite reached depth, through moments when she needed presence and received distraction instead, through the steady understanding that her inner world was being navigated alone, despite the appearance of partnership. Over time, she begins to see that she has already been alone in the ways that matter most. Psychologically, this marks a profound reorientation. Fear shifts from external absence to internal disconnection. She no longer asks, what if I end up alone? She asks, what if I continue living without myself? And in that question, the hierarchy of fear is rearranged. Unhappiness is no longer tolerable simply because it is familiar. Familiarity loses its power when it is recognized as stagnation. Many women describe this moment with startling clarity. I realized I was already doing life alone, one says, just with someone else in the room. Another reflects, I wasn't afraid of being single, I was afraid of being honest. These insights are not born of resentment, they are born of awareness. And awareness changes the cost-benefit analysis of staying. This does not mean she suddenly desires isolation. On the contrary, her capacity for connection often deepens. But she no longer confuses presence with intimacy. She understands that a relationship should expand her inner world, not compress it. And when it consistently fails to do so, solitude begins to look less like a threat and more like relief. There is courage in this shift, though it rarely announces itself as such. Choosing potential loneliness over certain unhappiness requires an internal anchoring that was not available to her before. She has learned to be with herself, to listen inwardly, to trust her own company. This is not something she could have done earlier, when her identity depended more heavily on external validation. Now her sense of self is strong enough to withstand absence. This is also the point at which she stops negotiating her worth. She no longer stays to prove loyalty, patience, or endurance. She understands that love does not require self-abandonment. And if remaining connected demands that she silence her truth, then the cost of that connection becomes too high. For those around her, this change can feel like detachment. But internally, it is integration. She is no longer splitting herself into the one who copes and the one who suffers. She is choosing alignment over attachment. And alignment, while quieter, is far more stable. Solitude, once feared, becomes a space of recovery. In it, she hears her own thoughts without interruption. She reconnects with desires that were overshadowed by compromise. She experiences peace not as the absence of conflict, but as the presence of coherence. This peace teaches her something vital. She is not incomplete on her own. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be unlearned. This does not mean she closes herself to love. It means she raises the standard for it. She becomes unwilling to trade her inner harmony for external security. She understands now that happiness is not guaranteed by partnership, but it is endangered by its absence of truth. When a woman no longer fears being alone more than being unhappy, she does not become hardened. She becomes free to choose relationships that meet her in presence, rather than proximity, free to walk away from dynamics that require her to shrink, free to stand in her own life without apology. This freedom is not loud. It does not need to be. It is the quiet confidence of someone who knows that the worst kind of loneliness is not found in solitude, but in staying where the self is slowly erased. So if you're wondering why women change after 40, they don't change because of age. They change because truth can only be postponed for so long. This stage of life doesn't destroy marriages. It reveals them. And the question is not, why is she different now? The real question is, did I ever truly meet who she was becoming? Because when a woman awakens to her worth, she doesn't ask for permission. She chooses alignment, and only the marriages built on emotional depth, not convenience, survive that awakening.